Hi guys, my name is Katherine Sheldon, and I'm going to be doing my older adult oral video presentation for Social Work 501. The person that I decided to interview for this project is an older woman named Carolyn. She kind of led a crazy life. She had her first child at 17. She was divorced at 24, and in between there, she did a lot of things. She ended up having 4 kids. She didn't learn to drive until she was 30, and I just think she really has an interesting and inspiring life story. So I was really grateful to be able to take this opportunity to, kind of understand more of her life and understand more of where she's coming from. So the developmental stage that I decided to focus on when discussing Carolyn was Erikson's stage of intimacy versus isolation. One thing that I really liked when I'm talking about intimacy versus isolation is what Rogers discussed in the book, which is how, it's the stage of life where we're still in young adulthood and we're still exploring what intimacy looks like without losing our own identity. This is really important because I feel like when we are young adults, and especially when you have so many kids and you're kind of discovering marriage and what that looks like, I think this is a really important part of how we grow and develop. So I think that's why I really chose to focus on this, and I think I really learned a lot about how I view different developmental stages from the project that I did. Some things that really affected Carolyn, there's a couple different places where I really think that she had the biggest crises that were part of her life. So the biggest thing for her would probably be having her first child at 17. Like I said, when Carolyn was 17, she gave birth to her first child, which changed her entire life. She was out of wedlock, she now had a child to raise, she had to work for and protect it. That was really difficult for her because she didn't even know much about being an adult herself. She hadn't graduated from school. She was only working a part-time job. She was on her own when she had this child. She had a significant other, but not a husband. And especially during the time that she did this, it was unheard of for a woman to do this. So for her to do that was just really impressive. She became divorced at 24 with 4 kids. One thing that Carolyn really discussed in our interview is how much she struggled with isolation. She really decided as a young adult to take care of her family first, but what that meant for her was when she got her divorce, that she not only was already isolated because she had so many kids to take care of, but she no longer even had a partner to rely on. And this was something that, she really struggled with as she continued to discover her own identity, is how to numb herself so that she wouldn't have to feel that pain. The next part of her life that I really think focuses on this developmental stage is when she began her job that she continued to work until she was 78 at 26. So this job was a work-from-home job that she took so that she could raise her family and really discuss them and take care of them. And that really changed the entire way that she was able to raise her kids. Before, she had to kind of situate herself out of the home. She really was fighting. Like I said, she didn't drive until she was 30. But when she was able to do this work-from-home job for the rest of her life, although she did learn to drive and she was able to be more independent in later adulthood, this really it helped her discover her own independence, and that even though she did have a little bit of struggles, she really was able to be somebody who could take care of herself, and that was a really big part of her own life. Carolyn had her first child at 17, which was before she graduated with her high school degree. In the 60s, this was absolutely unheard of. In the research that I read, Dunbar, Bernhold, Merola, and Giles all discussed that in the research, that after we go through hurtful experiences, such as being isolated, or with Carolyn, she had a little bit of domestic violence in her relationship with her husband, we not only feel isolated externally, like from actual society because we're raising a family, but internally, who can you go to, especially during that time period where domestic violence was really unheard of? You never divorced anybody. If domestic violence was happening, it wasn't discussed. So that's something that they really talked about in the article that I thought really pertained to Carolyn and the way her life was. She not only had to raise her own children, but that also developed how she viewed other men, how she viewed her own children who were male, 3 out of 4 of them. Like that developed her own views as she continued to develop into adulthood based on these hurtful experiences she had when she was still in young adulthood, where we're learning about intimacy versus isolation. During young adulthood, Erikson describes that we go through the crisis of intimacy versus isolation. In the book, it discusses that this is really a time where we want to connect, but as we're growing and we want to develop like our own sense of self, we really struggle because we want to connect with someone without losing what we already have. When we have those things that we really like that, seem like they're a part of us, we find somebody that we want to give it all to, and we lose that identity. We lose a part of ourselves. So we struggle with this during young adulthood because we don't know yet how to create those boundaries that help us to keep what we love while still finding how we love others. So this really creates an internal struggle because so much is already happening, and then on top of that you have to kind of discover intimacy versus isolation, and it's just a really intense crisis that we really have. For Carolyn, what this meant was that in her childhood, she grew up in the 50s, which there were not only struggles for women, but also any family that were in poverty. She grew up with 4 children. She was raised with a mother and father, but, they were really extremely poor. She discussed that she remembers times where they barely had enough food to eat, and, they had to make the decision, well, who got the most food or who gets to eat and who doesn't. Not only did they not have a car for most of her childhood, but also just she felt very invisible because she wasn't the child who needed the most help. So she saw a lot of things growing up that a lot of people don't see, on top of being a woman in a time where, although women had more respect than they may have previously, they weren't always being as respected as they should have been. She grew up really feeling that she had to overly protect herself because, women were looked down upon in workplaces and schools. They were told they didn't need education. They were thought to just be homemakers. But that didn't really stop her. Instead, she really went above and beyond what people expected from her and proved that she could get that respect of her peers. That's something that was really discussed in Wixberger and Kamek. Everything that happens in our childhood really directly impacts our development as adults. It impacts, how we view things, what we want to do for our own family, how we kind of struggle with maybe finances, with how we view other people, how do we protect ourselves. Are we more outgoing? Are we less social? Do we decide that instead of really wanting to interact with others, we want to stay as home buddies to protect ourselves? Those are all things that we see as being directly influenced from our childhood. And without that, without that correlation, you would really miss a lot of what's going on. And I think this is extremely true for Carolyn as well. There's a direct correlation between what happened in her childhood and how she reacted to having a child so young as an adult. The biggest event that probably impacted the resolution for her was her divorce of her husband at 24. Although she was emotionally strong, she talked about that in our entire interview, how emotionally strong she was. She never wanted to seem weak, even in our interview. She wanted to do what was right for them, and she raised them as she saw right. She no longer had that opportunity to really explore isolation and intimacy. When you have to put your family first, especially so young, you don't get to choose intimacy anymore. You now have to just accept isolation, and that can be a really terrifying thing for somebody so young, but also really empowering. And I think that she saw it both ways. Being a woman, as she said, a direct quote from her was, raising a family of 4 on your own can be very hard, even when you have support. But for a woman with no support, there's a stigma attached to why you're doing that or why you can't find a man, which Carolyn discussed a lot, not being able to find a man. Those are things that she experienced, and in a time where you were expected to have a husband, especially when you had kids, that was something that was just really intriguing to hear about and really hear how that impacted her. And as she continued to grow older, she decided whether, finding a man was worth it for her to let go of that isolation. And for her, she decided it wasn't. One way that you can also look at this is kind of the multi-system lens. So for Carolyn, what that means is she got very involved in the church. The church really became her second family. Once she had her first son, Rob, her family really didn't interact much with her. They didn't know how to handle that. They didn't know how to help her. She was so young, and they just wanted her to be successful. Her mother had always taught her, do the best you can and gain those respect from your peers. And when she had a child, she didn't quit. She didn't stop working towards that, but her focus changed, and her family didn't know how to handle that. And so she was very emotionally isolated from her family. So for her, she kind of threw herself into the church life, which was her religion, because she wanted to be accepted somewhere. And she did feel accepted there. She would go there multiple times a week and engage in church and engage in choir. And she became somebody who really loved that. And even though she was raised in a home with both parents, when she became pregnant, she was disowned. And that left her with responsibility that she didn't know how to handle and no support. So that's why she really latched onto the church, and it became something that really defined her as she became not only a young adult, but through maturity into older adulthood. That's something that really you can track how that kind of defined her, and her growth in the church is directly correlated to how she grew as a mother and eventually as a grandmother. Piaget's theory is the other theory that I decided to use to discuss. And something that, is a lot different from how Erikson describes it is that with Carolyn, this really could help discuss how, as a child, a lot of the things that she went through directly impact what her young adulthood was like. So, Piaget would discuss that the ages of 11 to 16 are super important for reasoning, not only internally, but also externally. So when Carolyn, was going through a lot of independence, was kind of being forgotten during those ages by her own family, then at 17, when she would have already been completely developed, as Piaget discusses, she would have been in a place where she didn't really understand reasoning. So how was she going to not only reason with herself and all those internal fears of intimacy or intimacy versus isolation, but also she's got to learn how to reason with other people to be able to get what she needs. And it wasn't so much that she needed to get things for her family, but that she needed to get things for herself that she wasn't able to get. And so, that pressure that she had as a kid really affected how she grew up and how she raised her own family. There are a lot of limitations when it comes to both these theories, both Erikson's, the systems theory, and actually Piaget's too. But the one that I really found was the most significant is the limitations of Erikson's. For example, Erikson's theory really discusses different timelines of life and development in very strict ages. And when somebody experiences trauma or they experience anything that might just have changed the way you develop, this really changes how you are gaining those or how you're kind of interpreting those. So, for example, some people experience that challenge of intimacy versus isolation when they're a lot younger than young adulthood, and that's because they might be a little more mature for their age. They might be discovering things about themselves that they never knew before, or maybe some sort of trauma or maybe a lack of trauma forced them into that young adulthood mindset before they were physically young adults. But also there are people who are just now in maturity that are still going through those same things. We don't always go through those stages in those set ages as Erikson wants us to. And so that's something that I think is really important to look at, when we're discussing any sort of theory and how it's directly correlated to ages. We need to really be able to accept that that's not going to be an overall factor of how people discuss, how people engage, and what people are thinking. When we're looking at humans and really how we all are psychologically, there's going to be trauma that impacts it. There's going to be maybe even culture. Culture is a huge factor. Culture, gender are a huge factor in how we develop. And when there's such a structured theory, it can become difficult to see that even though it sounds really good on paper, it may not be how it actually is overall. So that's something that we really want to be able to look at, is that, even though Erikson's theory, Piaget, and the systems lens theory are all very empowering and working together, they all can look at different pieces of someone like Carolyn's life. I think it's important to really be able to step back and say, well, how may she be outside of this? Because that's how we continue to grow. And that's how research continues to grow. So I think that, it's not only important to look at the benefits of it, but also how changes can be made, because that's really where we start to learn to benefit all clients, not only just the ones that fit into these limitations. The biggest thing that I really learned from Carolyn was how much we have so much more strength than we know that we have. And this was not only evidenced in how she raised her family, but also how she continued to grow internally throughout her entire life. She truly never let anything stop her in a way that was just incredible. Had she ever let go, had she ever lost her focus, she really would have struggled. And she did struggle, but never in a way that she didn't know her own self-worth, and never in a way where she wasn't able to persevere and push through. And this is really evidenced even now for Carolyn, because she knows a lot more about herself in older adulthood than she ever thought she could when she was younger. So here are the references I used. I used 3 out of the 5 references that I've researched over the course of class. I used Relational Change Following Hurtful Conflict, our textbook, which is Human Behavior in a Social Environment, and It's How I Am, It's What I Am, It's a Part of Who I Am. A narrative exploration of the impact of adolescent onset chronic illness on identity formation in young people. I use these because it talks about child psychology, and Carolyn does have diabetes, which she was diagnosed with when she was 16. So I thought this was important to kind of look at how that may have affected her over the course of her life. Thank you so much for watching my video, and I really hope that you enjoyed my presentation and were able to kind of learn as much about Carolyn and development as I was able to learn. So thank you. Bye-bye.